The air in Babylon was thick enough to choke on. June 323 BC. The heat sat on the city like a hand, pinning the smoke of the incense burners in place, mixing it with another smell underneath. Something sweet, something wrong. The smell of a body going bad. On a golden couch inside Nebuchadnezzar's old palace lay Alexander the Great. He had been dead for days. The man who conquered the known world was now just flesh in the Mesopotamian heat, swelling, his skin darkening to a bruised violet. Around him stood his generals, the men he called companions, brothers who had marched with him from Macedon to the edge of India. They did not weep. They argued, voices low, words sharp, hands already reaching for pieces of an empire that had not yet gone cold. This was no funeral. It was a watch kept by hungry men, waiting for the feast to begin. The oaths they had sworn to him rotted faster than his corpse. Somewhere in that palace sat a woman who understood exactly what was coming. Roxana, his wife born in Sogdiana, a foreigner surrounded by Macedonian soldiers who owed her nothing. She was pregnant. Inside her grew the only heir to a throne that had already stopped existing. A king with no army, a name with no crown, a target the moment he drew breath. Far to the west, in Epirus, another figure was listening for news. Olympias, Alexander's mother, a woman feared for her rights and her rage long before her son died. Grief was turning to something else inside her, a patience with teeth, a need to make someone pay, the grieving wife, the unborn child, the mother waiting in the shadows. For all three, the blood of Alexander was not a right to rule. It was a mark for slaughter. This is not the story of how an empire was split between generals. You have heard that story. This is the story of how one family was hunted, cornered, and wiped out. Every person who carried Alexander's blood would be dead within 20 years of that day in Babylon. His mother, his sister, his wives, his children, killed not by Persians, not by strangers, butchered by the same men who had knelt at his couch and sworn to guard everything he left behind. Tell us which city and country you are watching from in the comments below. And if you are ready for what happens next, take a moment to subscribe and support this work. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The body was not yet cold when the shouting started. Inside the great throne room at Babylon, under the same painted cedar ceiling where Nebuchadnezzar had once received tribute from half the world, the incense still hung thick in the air. But something new moved under it now, a hard edge, the taste of iron and want. The men who had bled across 3 continents for Alexander stood in a ring on the polished stone, staring at one another, and every hand had drifted to the grip of a sword. History would name them the Diadochi, the successors. In that room, they were simply frightened men measuring the distance to each other's throats. Outside those walls lay a city that had already begun to feel abandoned by its gods. Babylon, in June of 323 BC, was a place of contradictions. The Euphrates cut through it, sluggish and brown in the summer heat. The great walls Alexander had ordered rebuilt still stood half-finished, scaffolding rotting against ancient brick. He had meant to make this city the capital of the whole world. He had drained the marshes, planned a harbor for 1,000 ships, dreamed of a temple to Bel, taller than anything ever raised. Now the plans sat rolled in their cases, and the man who ordered them lay dead at 32. At the middle of the crisis stood Perdiccas, senior cavalry commander, proud and good enough at war to have earned the pride, In Alexander's last hours, when the fever had burned the words out of him and he could no longer speak, the officers had crowded the sick room and asked him one question: "To whom do you leave your kingdom?" Arrian records the answer, or the legend of it: 2 words, "to the strongest." And then, some said, Alexander pulled the imperial signet ring from his own swollen finger and pressed it into Perdiccas's hand. To Perdiccas, that gesture meant everything. It meant he was the regent, the keeper of one empire undivided, the guardian of the legacy. He looked around the room for allies and found only competitors. He was a man trying to hold a shattered mirror together with his palms, and the edges were already cutting him. Off to the side stood Ptolemy, son of Lagus. He had grown up alongside Alexander in the court at Pella, one of the young companions banished together when they backed the prince against his own father. He had followed Alexander from the wet green hills of Macedon to the red dust beyond the Indus, commanded troops at the Persian gates, taken the fortress of a rebel prince in the mountains of Sogdiana. He was clever in a slow, patient way. He wrote things down. Years later, his own account of these campaigns would survive long enough for Arrian to build a history from it. He knew a thing the shouting men had not yet grasped, that power lives in the story people tell about it, not only in the men who carry spears. So while the others postured and raised their voices, Ptolemy kept quiet and did the arithmetic in his head. The empire could not be held. It stretched from the Adriatic to the Punjab, too big, too fresh, stitched together with nothing but the will of one man. And that man was rotting on a couch down the hall. Ptolemy was not trying to save any of it. He was choosing the peace he wanted. The oldest peace, the richest peace, the one ringed by desert and sea and easy to defend. He wanted Egypt. He had wanted it since he first saw the Nile flood the black fields. He would do whatever the taking of it required. And in the shadow of the doorway waited a younger man with a still face and something ugly moving behind it. Cassander, son of Antipater, the old regent who had ruled Macedon in Alexander's name for years while the king marched east. But Cassander was not his father. He carried a private hatred, and it had teeth. He had seen the court up close during his brief time in Babylon. He had watched Macedonian officers press to bow to the ground in the Persian style, the proskynesis, foreheads to the floor before a man they had once drunk with. Plutarch tells that years later, grown and a king himself, Cassander walked into a shrine at Delphi, saw a statue of Alexander, and his whole body seized with a shudder and a cold sweat so violent he could barely stand. That was how deep the fear and the loathing ran. He had watched Alexander take on the dress and the manner of the men they had conquered. He had watched a king behave like a god and forget the mud he came from. Cassander despised all of it. While the others wept or pretended to, something cold burned low in his gut. He did not want to protect Alexander's legacy. He wanted to scrape the name off the world. These were the men who would decide the fate of a bloodline, a regent clutching at a ghost, a historian planning a robbery, a hater biding his time. None of them would blink at murder. There was one more voice in the room that mattered, and it did not belong to the cavalry. It belonged to the infantry, to the phalanx, and it spoke through a man named Meleager. The foot soldiers had marched every mile Alexander marched, and they distrusted the mounted nobles who now stood carving up the world. When the cavalry proposed to wait for Roxana's unborn child, the phalanx erupted. They did not want a half-Persian infant fathered on a barbarian woman. They wanted Macedonian blood, alive and standing. So Meleager led them to Arrhidaeus, Their first act as a united command was a lie, and it was almost elegant in its cowardice. They called a formal assembly. Outside the palace, the Macedonian infantry was roaring, hammering spears against shields, a sound like a slow avalanche, demanding a king by blood and not by committee. The generals could not name one of their own. To crown any single man was to start the war that day, so they built a fiction everyone could agree to repeat for a little while longer. They dragged Arrhidaeus into the light, Alexander's half-brother, son of Philip the Dachshund, by a Thessalian dancer, a grown man with the mind of a child, whether from a childhood poisoning ordered by Olympias herself, as some whispered, or from birth, no one could say, and no one truly cared. He was perfect, a crown that would never argue. They wrapped him in the royal cloak and named him Philip III, King of Macedon, a king who would never form a plan or a preference or a single thought that ruled anything. For a few days, the two factions nearly came to open blood inside the city. The cavalry pulled back from Babylon. Meleager held the palace and the puppet king. Then a fragile deal was struck, and Perdiccas moved fast. During a ritual purification of the army, a ceremony of marching between the halves of a slaughtered dog, Perdiccas had the ringleaders of the infantry mutiny seized. Meleager fled to a temple for sanctuary. It did not save him. He was cut down at the altar. Some 300 soldiers were thrown under the feet of the war elephants and crushed on the plain outside the walls, the animals trained to press a man's skull into the dirt. The Macedonian army had killed its own before Alexander was even in the ground. That settled the crown, but not the whole succession. The other half of the answer was still floating in the belly of a terrified woman. They ruled that if Roxana carried a boy, that infant would rule as co-king beside his simple uncle. So the empire got its monarchs, a man who could not govern himself and a baby not yet born. The generals lined up and swore loyalty to this hollow crown. Every last one of them was lying, and every last one of them knew the others were lying too. The first blood inside the palace was not drawn by a general. It was drawn by a mother who could count. Roxana had survived the knife politics of a Bactrian fortress, the rock of Sogdiana where her father Oxyartes had held out against the whole Macedonian army, and she had won the heart of the man who broke Persia. She knew exactly how thin the ice under her feet was. To the Macedonians, she was the barbarian wife, the foreign woman, tolerated because Alexander had loved her, and now barely tolerated at all. Her one card was the child inside her, but there was a second wife. At Susa, in the spring of 324 BC, in a mass wedding meant to bind Greek and Persian together, Alexander had also married Statira, daughter of the dead king Darius. 80 of his officers took Persian brides that same week, reclining on couches in a pavilion under embroidered canopies, wine flowing for 5 days. Statira was Persian royalty, a living symbol of the two worlds joined, and a womb that might yet produce a boy with a claim in both languages, a rival to Roxana's son before either child could walk. Roxana would not let that stand. Perdiccas gave his quiet blessing. A simpler line of succession suited him too. So Roxana wrote a letter. Plutarch records the scheme. She forged it in Alexander's hand, dated it before his death, and sent it summoning Statira and her sister Drypatis to Babylon. The two Persian women came without suspicion. Drypatis had been married to Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion, dead himself less than a year. Two widows answering a dead king's call, they walked into Roxana's chambers, expecting the shared grief of royal women. It was a killing floor. What happened in that room did not survive in the record. The ending did. Both princesses were murdered. Their bodies were carried out, weighted, and dropped down a well. Then the well was filled with earth to hide what lay at the bottom. Roxana had cleared the field. Her unborn son was now the only heir with Alexander's blood and no other. It was a cold, exact act, done for survival and nothing else, and it set the rule for the whole age that followed. In the world Alexander left behind, there would be no mercy and no sentiment. There would only be the one still breathing at the end. Within weeks, the child came, a boy. They named him Alexander, the fourth of that name, and set him on a throne he could not yet see over, king of Macedon, lord of Asia, master of everything from the Nile to the Indus, and unable to hold up his own head. For 2 years the empire held its breath. Alexander's corpse stayed in Babylon, and here the historians pause on a detail they could not explain. Plutarch and others report that for days after death, in the furnace heat of a Mesopotamian summer, the body showed no sign of corruption. It stayed clean, they wrote, and fresh. Some took it as proof of divinity. Modern doctors have argued it was something colder, that Alexander may not have been fully dead when they thought him gone, paralyzed by disease while still breathing. Whatever the truth, the Egyptian and Chaldean embalmers finally came, opened the body, and preserved it, sealing it against the heat, packing it for the road. Perdiccas understood the corpse better than anyone. It was not a dead man. It was the most powerful object on earth. Whoever owned those bones owned the right to speak in Alexander's name. So he ordered a carriage built, and he ordered it to be the greatest funeral vehicle ever seen by human eyes. It was not a hearse. It was a temple that rolled. The historian Diodorus Siculus wrote down what it looked like, and the description reads like a fever. A vaulted golden roof shaped in overlapping scales, like the hide of some vast fish, set with gemstones that threw light in every direction. At each corner, a golden figure of Nike, goddess of victory, held out a trophy. A colonnade of Ionic columns ran around the coffin. A banner of purple and gold flew above, worked with the image of Alexander himself, seated in a chariot, a scepter in his hand, guards of Macedonians and Persians walking to either side. The inner chamber hung with painted scenes of his campaigns, ranks of war elephants, warships with their oars. Golden bells hung from a net around the roof and sounded down the road. The coffin, they said, was hammered gold, and the space around the body was packed with spices to sweeten the air. The whole thing was so heavy, it needed 2 axles fitted with a system meant to keep it level over rough ground, and 64 picked mules to draw it, harnessed in 4 teams. Each mule wore a gilded crown, and from each hung a bell, so that the monument came down the road inside a slow storm of ringing that could be heard long before it was seen. Diodorus says the work took 2 years, and the sum spent on it was beyond reckoning. When it was done, it was a message stamped in gold. It told the world that the empire still stood, that its regent still ruled, that the founder was going home in triumph. Crowds turned out at every town along the way just to look at it. Whole populations lining the road to watch the god pass. The route was set. From Babylon up the Euphrates, across Mesopotamia and into Syria, north and west, over the mountains and down toward the Macedonian heartland. The destination was Aegae, the old capital, where the kings of that house had always been buried, where Philip the II himself lay under a great earthen mound. One last procession to bind the empire back together with the weight of the dead. Perdiccas thought He was locking down his own power. He thought he owned the story. He was wrong, and the man who proved him wrong was the quiet one in Egypt. Ptolemy had followed every report of the carriage inching along its route, the road crews leveling the ground ahead, the pace of a few miles a day. He had heard of the mules, the bells, the gold, the 2-year labor, and he saw the opening, the whole thing left wide open. There was an old story repeated in the sources that an oracle had once said the land where Alexander lay buried would prosper without end and never be conquered. Ptolemy meant that land to be his. Agai was the past. A tomb in the old country was a full stop on a life that was over. Ptolemy did not want the full stop. He wanted the beginning of something, his own. So, as the procession crawled through Syria, Ptolemy did not send an envoy. He did not lodge a protest. He came out of Egypt at the head of an army and marched to meet it. It was a raw, open act of theft, and its target was the holiest object in the Greek world. He intercepted the column somewhere near Damascus. There was no great battle. The escort commander, a man named Arrhidaeus, who shared the puppet king's name and answered to Perdiccas, stood frozen, or perhaps he was already bought. His job was to walk a god's body home. To draw a sword in defense of the coffin against a fellow Macedonian general was to commit sacrilege in front of the whole procession. It was a thing no one had planned for because no one had believed anyone would dare. Ptolemy dared. He did not merely challenge the regent's authority. He seized the corpse of Alexander the Great. His soldiers ringed the golden carriage, the mules braying and stamping, the bells clattering, and then falling quiet as hands took hold of the harness. He took the coffin. He took the sacred remains of the man every general in that generation had followed to the ends of the map. It was the boldest move of the entire age. He was not stealing a body. He was stealing the meaning of the empire. He was claiming its founder as his personal possession in front of witnesses and daring anyone to stop him. Perdiccas held the signet ring. Ptolemy now held the king. Stories like this one, the forged letters, the bodies in the well, the theft of a corpse on an open road, the war elephants pressing men into the dirt, do not come easy. They take real digging, real hours in Diodorus and Plutarch and Arrian, and a refusal to flatten the past into something simple and comfortable. Telling them at this depth is the whole reason this channel exists, and it stays possible because of a small group of viewers who chose to step inside the inner circle. The lineage, joining, the lineage makes you more than someone watching. It makes you part of the work, part of the team that keeps these hard, unvarnished stories alive and told with the care they are owed. It is what keeps these investigations independent and the production honest. If what you are watching means something to you, if you feel the pull of the deep past, I want you with us. You get early access to the documentaries and other perks, but the real thing is this: you become a patron of the entire project. Follow the link and join the ranks. Ptolemy turned the whole procession south. He steered the Golden Temple away from Macedon, away from the tombs of Alexander's fathers, and drove it into Egypt. He brought it first to Memphis, the old capital of the pharaohs, a city of temples and granite older than Macedon itself, where the priests of Ptah received the body under the eyes of gods carved 1,000 years before. Later still, it would be moved to Alexandria, the city Alexander himself had founded on the coast, and laid in a tomb the Ptolemies would show to visitors for centuries. Augustus would come and place flowers on it and knock off a piece of the nose by accident. Caligula would strip its breastplate to wear himself, but that was all still to come. For now the conqueror of the world lay down in Egypt, not among his own people in the land of the pyramids. Ptolemy had spoken, and the message was written across the sky. He was no longer a general taking orders. He was a king in everything but the name, the true successor, sanctified by the physical presence of the founder in his own realm. When the news reached Babylon, Perdiccas came apart. The insult left no room for interpretation. The great fiction of a single empire held together by a ring and a lie was finished, and now the regent had to choose. Let the theft stand, and watch every other general read it as permission. Or gather the imperial army, take the two kings, the idiot and the infant, and march the whole apparatus of the empire down into Egypt to hunt the man who had made him look like a fool before the world. He chose the march. The wars of the successors did not begin over borders or treasure or crowns. They began over a corpse in a golden box, and Perdiccas was already at the edge of the Nile, staring at the brown flood, with an army behind him and every crocodile in the river waiting for what came next. While the great generals waged their war over a stolen corpse along the Nile, the heart of the empire began to rot from the inside. In Macedon, the old regent Antipater lay dying. He was near 80, a survivor from the world of Philip II, one of the last men alive who remembered Macedon before it swallowed Greece. He had governed the homeland for a dozen years, while Alexander marched to the edge of the world. He had crushed the Greek revolt at Cranon, broken the Spartans under King Agis in the field, kept the treasury full and the borders quiet, while a whole generation of Macedonian youth bled out in Asia. In 319 BC, his body finally failed him, and with his last orders, he lit a fire that would burn the kingdom down. He had a son, Cassander, a man of ferocious ambition and a cold, patient mind, kept for years in the second rank, while lesser men rose above him. Every officer in Macedon expected the regency to pass to him by right of blood. Antipater knew his son too well. He had watched him grow, and he had seen what lived behind the still face. So, on his deathbed, in his residence at Pella, he passed his own son over. He named a different man regent, Polyperchon, an aging campaigner who had fought under Philip and Alexander, both loyal, steady, and without a scrap of political cunning. To Cassander he gave only a lesser post, the command of the cavalry, a subordinate's rank beneath the new regent. It was the choice of a soldier who wanted the kingdom held on an even keel. It was not the choice of a father who understood what such a judgment would do to his heir. For Cassander, it was not a political setback. It was a wound driven in by the one man he could not answer back. His own father, in his final hour, had looked at him and found him unfit to rule. The hatred that already smoldered in him for Alexander, for the whole memory of the god-king who had ruled from a Persian throne and demanded Macedonians grovel on their faces, now had a second and nearer target. He would not serve under Polyperchon. He would not stand aside and watch another man hold what he believed his blood had earned. He gave out that he was going hunting in the countryside, so no one would mark his absence, then slipped across the sea. He sent envoys to Antigonus the One-Eyed in Asia, the most powerful of all the successors, a giant of a man who had lost an eye in Philip's wars, and to Ptolemy in Egypt, knitting together a coalition against the very regency his father had built. Macedon was about to tear itself apart, and this time the wounds would be self-inflicted. Far to the west, across the mountains in Epirus, an aging woman heard that Antipater was dead and understood at once that her hour had come round again. Olympias, mother of Alexander, daughter of the Molossian royal house, initiated into the mystery cults of Samothrace, where legend said she had first met Philip as a young girl in the torchlit rites. Her enemies swore she kept great tame serpents in her bed and drew living snakes from the sacred baskets during the ecstatic rites of Dionysus. Plutarch set the rumors down without deciding them. Some were true. She was a woman of savage will who had spent years locked in a feud with Antipater, firing letters to Alexander in Asia, accusing the old regent of aiming at the throne. Alexander had once said dryly that his mother charged a high rent for the 9 months she had carried him. Now the grief for a murdered son and murdered dreams had hardened into something with an edge. For years the generals had shoved her aside and treated her as a relic of a finished age. The chaos now spreading through Macedon was the crack in the door she had been waiting for. Polyperchon, hemmed in and short of allies, made her an offer. Come home, take charge of your grandson, the child king, lend the regency the weight of Alexander's blood. Olympias looked at Polyperchon and did not see a leader. She saw a tool. He held the title and almost no real power. She held no title at all, but she was the mother of the god, the last living vessel of the founder's line. He needed legitimacy. She needed an army. The bargain was struck. Polyperchon marched for his own survival. Olympias marched for something older and darker. She was going home to seat her grandson, the boy Alexander IV, firmly on the throne. And she was going home to erase the house of Antipater from the earth, and every man who had ever slighted her along with it. She did not come as a grieving queen. She came as vengeance wearing an old woman's face. Her forces crossed into Macedonia in the autumn of 319 BC, and with her rode the Molossian king Aeacides of Epirus, her kinsman, lending his own troops to the march. Against her stood the puppet king Philip III and his young wife Eurydice. Eurydice was no ornament. She was a granddaughter of Philip II through his daughter Sinon, a woman whose own mother had been an Illyrian princess trained to arms, and Eurydice had been raised the same way, taught to ride and to fight. She had taken real command of the loyalist forces, issuing orders in the king's name because the king could issue none of his own, the first woman in Macedon to lead an army into the field. But when the two hosts came within sight of each other on the open plain, the loyalist ranks looked across the ground and saw the mother of Alexander the Great standing beneath her banners. They would not level a single spear at her. The line came apart on its own. Men grounded their arms and walked across the field to join her. Philip and Eurydice tried to flee toward Amphipolis and were run down and taken. They were prisoners now, and after so many years of enforced silence, Olympias meant to enjoy the taking of them. Her revenge was not quick. It was staged, drawn out, built for humiliation. She had the royal pair thrown into a cell so cramped they could neither stand upright nor lie flat. For days they crouched in the dark, bread and water pushed to them through a gap too narrow to reach an arm through, the reek of their own bodies thickening in the closed air. She let them rot in it. She wanted them to taste the whole of their fear before she cut it off. Then she staged the ending. Her attendants came to the cell. They carried no death warrant. They carried a choice. They set 3 things down before Eurydice on the stone floor: a sword, a coil of rope, a cup of hemlock. Olympias was granting her the courtesy of choosing the manner of her own death. It was one last twist of the knife dressed up as mercy. But Eurydice had ridden with armies and given them orders, and she did not fold. She did not weep, and she did not plead. She looked at the 3 instruments laid out for her and she spoke a curse over Olympias, praying aloud that the queen herself would one day be handed gifts exactly like these. Then she tended first to her husband's body, laying out the dead king with her own hands, binding his wounds with her veil, as though it could still matter, before she tore long strips from her own tunic, twisted them into a cord, and hanged herself from the beam. She died on her own terms, and her captors carried that curse out of the cell with them. Philip III, the simple king who had understood none of it, had already been stabbed to death by Thracian killers sent in ahead of her. He had worn the crown for 6 years and made not one decision in it. He died as helpless as he had reigned. The first stage of the reckoning was done. It was not enough. Her hatred had no floor to it. She turned on the whole faction of the dead Antipater. She ordered the killing of Cassander's brother Nicanor. Then she opened a purge across the Macedonian nobility. Around 100 of Cassander's leading friends and partisans were seized and butchered without any trial, and she did not stop at the living. She went to the tomb of another of Cassander's brothers, Iolaus, the young man who had served as Alexander's cupbearer at the fatal drinking party in Babylon, and whom rumor named as the poisoner. She had the tomb broken open. She dragged his bones out into the daylight and scattered them, so that his shade could never find rest in the underworld. That was the error that finished her. The Macedonians could stomach a great deal. They had watched war elephants press mutineers into the dirt outside Babylon. But they held their dead sacred, and their old ancestral laws sacred. And here was a woman ripping bones from a grave and slaughtering their nobles like penned cattle. They had welcomed her home as Alexander's mother. Now they looked at her and saw a tyrant who honored nothing and no one. The love that had melted an army before her began to curdle into the thing that would soon turn it against her. Cassander came back. He was campaigning in the Peloponnese when the news reached him, and he force-marched north through Thessaly. Polyperchon's son tried to hold the mountain passes against him and failed. So Cassander sent part of his men around by sea and forced the road. He landed in the heart of Macedon, and the people flooded to his banner. Not only soldiers, fathers and brothers and sons of the 100 nobles Olympias had murdered, men carrying a grief she herself had planted in their chests. The tide reversed with terrible speed. The hunter became the hunted. Polyperchon's army, which should have shielded her, melted away or defected, and Polyperchon himself proved unable to break through to her aid. Olympias was forced to fall back, dragging her court behind her, and with her went Roxana and the boy king Alexander IV, now about 6 years old, her living shield, her last claim to rule in anyone's name, along with her Molossian kin, Thessalonike, the daughter of Philip II, and a knot of loyal cavalry. Cassander pinned them all inside the walled coastal town of Pydna on the Thermaic Gulf, the sea at their backs, and his army sealing the landward side. He did not mean to storm the walls and spill his own men. He meant to let the season do his work. Winter was closing in, and the sea lanes that might have carried grain to her were shutting with it. The siege of Pydna became a slow descent into a private hell. The months dragged toward spring, and the town began to starve. The stored grain went first. Then the pack animals and the cavalry horses were slaughtered and eaten down to the hides. Then the people gnawed leather straps and boiled weeds pulled from between the stones and chewed anything that had once held life. Soldiers began slipping over the walls in the dark to give themselves up to Cassander rather than waste away inside. Discipline came apart. Diodorus records the lowest of it plainly. Some of the starving turned on the bodies of the dead and ate them. Olympias had brought war elephants into the town, the great beasts that had carried her son's legend across Asia and India, and now they stood dying in their pens with no fodder to give them, their huge frames folding into the frozen mud one after another, the mahouts helpless beside them. The queen, who had swept back into Macedon like a returning goddess, was shut in a frozen town of corpses, breathing its stench, listening through the walls of her own quarters to the low, steady sound of men dying. When at last the ice broke and a relief force under Aeacides tried to reach her, his own war-weary Epirote soldiers mutinied on the march and turned back, and the door of hope closed for good. In the spring of 316 BC, she surrendered. She sent to Cassander and negotiated terms. He gave his word that she would come to no harm. He swore it. The oath was worthless the moment it left his lips. Cassander had meant her to die from the first, but he understood the danger of killing her with his own open hand. Even now, her great son 8 years in his Egyptian tomb, the shadow of Alexander still hung over his mother. So he arranged a spectacle instead. He first sent men to her secretly, offering to let her escape by ship to Athens, hoping she would flee and drown or be lost at sea and free him of the deed. She refused. She would not run. She demanded to be tried before the whole assembly of the Macedonians in the open to answer her accusers to their faces. Cassander could not allow that. Her voice in front of the army was the one weapon he feared most. So he summoned the assembly and had the charges against her read out while she herself was kept away, given no chance to stand and answer. He salted the crowd with the relatives of her victims to guarantee the verdict. The outcome was fixed before the first word. They condemned her to death. Then Cassander sent soldiers to carry out the sentence, and here the thing broke on him. They marched to her house with weapons drawn. They threw the doors open, and there she stood, an old woman alone in her royal robes, her chin lifted, her face full of cold contempt for them. And they did not see the butcher of Pydna. They saw the mother of Alexander. Their hands wavered, their nerve went out of them. One by one they turned and walked back out into the street, and not one of them raised a blade to her. They could not do it. Cassander was enraged. His clean plan had come apart on her doorstep. If the soldiers would not kill her, he would find men who would. He gathered up the families of the nobles she had purged, the kin of the 100 she had slaughtered without trial. He put weapons in their hands, pointed them at her house, and let them loose. This was no execution now. It was a mob with a grievance she had built for them herself. They stormed the residence carrying the grief she had planted, and they found her in the main hall, unarmed, only 2 of her serving women beside her. She did not scream. She did not beg for her life. Plutarch says she met them without one cry unworthy of her descent, and that even as they struck her down, she gathered her robes about her legs and drew her hair over her face so that her body would fall with dignity and not lie exposed. The circle of hatred closed. They came with swords and daggers and stones, and they struck her and did not stop striking until she lay still on the floor. The serpent queen of Epirus, the mother of the man who had conquered the known world, died in her own blood at 62, and on Cassander's order her body was left where it fell unburied, denied the very rights she had torn from the bones of Iolaus. The curse of Eurydice had come home. The story of this family is a maze of oaths sworn and broken, of blood answered with blood. To walk it properly, you need a guide, And the oldest guide we have is the man whose words shape this whole account, Diodorus Siculus of Sicily, writing in the century before Christ from sources now lost to us. His universal history is like an archive salvaged from a vanished world, and it is the bedrock of what you are hearing right now. We have put a modern, readable edition of his work within your reach. Tap the View Products button on your screen. This book is not only reading, it is the raw testimony of the tragedy itself, the direct voice of antiquity carried across 2,000 years, and it belongs on the shelf of anyone who feels the pull of this age. While you are there, look across the rest of the collection. We have gathered a set of themed relics and dark memorabilia to stand beside it. Open the shop now and see what waits for you. With Olympias dead and her corpse left to the birds by Cassander's command, the last true remnants of Alexander's bloodline stood defenseless. Roxana and her son, the boy Alexander the Vir, 7 years old now, had no vengeful queen left to shield them. They were nothing more than prisoners. Cassander stripped them of their last attendants, of the Persian and Macedonian servants who had followed them all the way from Babylon, of anyone who still carried loyalty to the Argead house, or who might one day remember aloud that the boy was royal. He took away the child's royal dress and his royal title in daily use, and ordered him raised as a common boy, in secret, with no honors and no court around him. Then he shut them both away in the remote fortress of Amphipolis, on the far bank of the Strymon River, behind walls that no army was marching to breach, under the watch of a garrison commander named Glaucias, a man who answered to Cassander and to no one else on earth. On paper, the child was still king of Macedon and lord of Asia, master of everything from the Adriatic to the Indus. His kingdom had shrunk to a single stone room. His guardian was the man who had left his grandmother's body to rot in the open air. And beyond the walls of Amphipolis, the other successors were watching and waiting and whispering the same thing to one another. The boy was growing older by the year. Soon he would be old enough to rule in fact, and not in name. And a living king of Alexander's blood, breathing behind those walls, was the one thing none of them could allow to reach the age of a man. Behind the walls of Amphipolis, the last king of the world was learning to be no one. Roxana and her son, Alexander IV, 7 years old, had become entries in Cassander's ledger. Property. The fortress sat on a bend of the Strymon, where the river loops almost all the way around the hill. A natural moat of slow brown water, its stone raised generations before to hold back Thracian raiders pushing down from the north. The town below had once been the richest in the region, its harbor thick with timber ships carrying Macedonian pine to build the fleets of Athens, its walls famous enough that Thucydides had wept over losing it. Now the fortress held one small boy and his mother. The royal servants were gone, dismissed the moment Olympias fell. In their place stood guards who took their orders from Cassander and answered to no memory of the old dynasty. Common slaves brought the food. No one bowed. No one used the titles. The child who was, by blood and by the letter of the law, king of Macedon and lord of Asia, master of every road from the Adriatic to the Indus, was addressed as a boy and nothing more. His grandmother's body still lay unburied somewhere in the open air, denied even a mound of earth, and the boy's name, the one thing left to him, was about to become the most dangerous thing he owned. Cassander did not hate the way Olympias had hated. Hers was a fire that consumed everything within reach and then turned on itself. His was slower, a patient grinding down, he did not only want the bloodline dead, he wanted the memory of it painted over, stone by stone, until nothing of Alexander was left standing that did not also carry his own name. So he set out to build his legacy on the rubble of another man's, and he began with the dead as much as the living. He gathered the corpses of Philip III and Eurydice, the king and queen Olympias had destroyed in that cramped cell, and he gave them a royal burial at Aigai, in the ancestral ground of the Macedonian kings. He buried Eurydice's mother Cynae beside them. The warrior princess Olympias's faction had also cut down. He held funeral games in their honor, foot races and single combat before the tombs, the crowds watching men bleed in the dust in the name of a murdered king. It was a calculated act of piety, a way of standing forth as the man who restored order after the horror the old queen had unleashed. Then he turned to marriage. He took Thessalonike to wife. She was a daughter of Philip II, by a Thessalian woman named Siculus, a half-sister of Alexander, born around the time of a great cavalry victory in Thessaly and named for it. She had survived the slaughter at Pydna only because Cassander wanted her. Taking her gave his future sons a thread of the old royal blood. It was a way of swallowing the dynasty rather than merely killing it, of grafting the Argead line onto his own, so that when the last true heir died, the name would live on only through him. Then he went to the shore of the Thermaic Gulf and founded a new port, drawing the people of 26 scattered villages into one walled city on the site of ancient Therma. He named it for his wife, Thessaloniki. The name still stands on the map today, a living monument to Cassander, built from a brick pried out of the house he was preparing to pull down. His next move drove the point deeper. He rebuilt Potidaea, the old Corinthian colony on the neck of the Pallene Peninsula, a city that Philip II himself had once stormed and handed to the people of Olympias. On the cleared ground, he raised something larger and richer, and he stamped his own name across it, Cassandreia. In the same years, he restored Thebes, the great city Alexander had burned to the ground in 335 BC as a warning to all of Greece, killing thousands and selling the rest into slavery. Cassander called the exiles home and razed the walls Alexander had thrown down. The message needed no explaining to anyone in Greece. What Alexander had destroyed, Cassander rebuilt. The age of Philip and Alexander was finished. The age of Cassander had begun. He was not a caretaker holding a throne for a child. He was a founder, a maker of cities, a king who had not yet said the word aloud. Every wall he raised and every temple he dedicated was another shovel of earth over the Argead grave. And in a stone room at Amphipolis, the last true heir of that line grew a little taller with each turning of the year, and each year became a heavier problem. The boy was a ghost, haunting the wars of grown men, a prisoner in Macedon, yes, but a name that could still be swung like a blade across the whole of Asia. The great generals had not stopped fighting. They tore at one another from the coast of Ionia to the passes of the Zagros, and they kept the child's name in their mouths the entire time. Antigonus the One-Eyed, the oldest of them, a man past 60, who had lost his eye to a catapult bolt in Philip's siege wars, and stood a head taller than any officer in his tent, now held most of Alexander's Asian conquests. He cast himself as the boy's protector. In the summer of 315 BC, at a great assembly of his army near Tyre, he issued a proclamation demanding that Cassander stand trial for the murder of Olympias, restore Thessalonike and the young king to their proper dignity, and free the empire from his grip. Ptolemy in Egypt and Seleucus, who had been driven out of Babylon by Antigonus and taken refuge on the Nile, echoed the same demands whenever it served them. None of them meant a word of it. The boy was a useful fiction, a fountain of legitimacy each of them could drink from while dividing the world. But a fiction left alive too long can turn solid. As Alexander the Dwarf climbed toward manhood, the risk grew that one of these warlords would stop pretending, march to Amphipolis, and set the real king on a real throne as his own puppet, uniting the empire under a single hand. The wars bled the treasuries white and left whole cities in ash. Antigonus stripped the forests of Lebanon and Cilicia to build a fleet from nothing, marching Phoenician woodcutters to the sea in their thousands. By 311 BC, even the strongest of them were spent, so they agreed to stop, at least on paper. The settlement is remembered as the peace of the dynasts. It recognized what each man already held. Cassander kept Europe and the regency of Macedon. Ptolemy kept Egypt and the lands bordering it. Antigonus kept the whole of Asia. Lysimachus, the old bodyguard said to have killed a lion with his bare hands in a hunting pit, kept Thrace. The lines were drawn, and the fighting paused, but buried in the terms was one clause that mattered more than all the borders, a concession to a legitimacy none of them believed in, and all of them still feared. The treaty said, in plain language, that Cassander would hold his authority as general of Europe only until Alexander IV came of age. On that day, the boy would take up the whole of the empire undivided as its one lawful king. Those words were a death sentence dressed as a peace term. The moment the ink dried, the child's fate was fixed. A treaty meant to end the killing made one more killing unavoidable. Cassander could read the arithmetic without effort. The boy was about 12 or 13. In Macedon, a boy crossed into manhood at 14 when he could bear arms and take his place among the assembly of soldiers. The clock had already started, and it ran only one way. He could not let Alexander reach that threshold. To let him grow up was to sign his own ruin. Diodorus records that already the Macedonians were beginning to talk, saying openly that the boy should be released from confinement and given his father's kingdom, and that some of the officers were murmuring the same in their cups. The rival generals would have a legal reason to invade in the king's name. The people, who still felt the old pull toward Alexander's line, might rise for the young king the instant he stepped out of the fortress. The prisoner had stopped being a convenience. He had become a fuse burning down, and Cassander meant to cut it before it reached the powder. There was no proclamation this time, no charge of treason, no assembly of the army, no theater like the one that had ended Olympias. Cassander had watched that spectacle nearly slip from his grasp when the first soldiers turned and refused their swords at her door. He would not repeat it. This had to be silent, clean, something he could deny with a level voice. Somewhere in the year 310 or 309 BC, he sent a short order north to Amphipolis, to the garrison commander Glaucius, the man he had personally set over the prisoners. The order, Diodorus writes, was to murder the boy and his mother in secret, to bury the bodies, and to breathe no word to anyone of what had been done or when. Poison was the instrument. What Roxana understood in those last days is beyond recovering. She was still a young woman, not yet 40, and she had been running from this end since the day her husband stopped breathing in Babylon in June of 323 BC. For 13 years, she had lived inside fear, holding her son the way a drowning woman holds a plank. She had come out of the fortress on the rock of Sogdiana, where her father Oxyartes had defied the whole Macedonian army until picked climbers took the cliffs by night. She had come through the wolf pit of Babylon. She had ordered the murder of Statera and watched the bodies go down the well. She had bent under the patronage of one ambitious man after another, Perdiccas first, then Antipater, then Olympias. She had starved inside Pydna and smelled the war elephants dying in their pens through the winter. She had seen a queen beaten to death by a mob at her own door. She had been stripped of her rank and buried alive behind stone above the river. And through all of it, she had held to one thing, that the boy would live to sit on his father's throne. Perhaps, watching him grow tall in the gray light of the fortress, learning his letters from whatever tutor Cassander allowed, and his horsemanship in the walled yard, she let herself believe they had nearly won. Perhaps she trusted for a moment that the treaty would hold, that the whole world had signed its name to her son's future. Or perhaps she already knew, the way a trapped animal knows, that the days had run out. The end did not come with drawn steel. It came with a meal. The poison went into the food or the wine, carried in by hands that would not meet their eyes. There was no fight. History wrote down no last words, no final act of defiance. Only a woman and her boy, the last king of Alexander's line, dying together in a locked room above the river, the sound of the Strymon moving past the walls, the only witness. Alexander the Or was 13 years old. He had been a king every day of his short life, and free on none of them. Glaucius carried out the order to the letter. The deaths were sealed as a state secret. The two bodies were put into the ground quietly, in graves left without names or markers. And for a while, Cassander kept the pretense running. Documents still went out across Macedon under the name of King Alexander IV, as though the boy were alive and reigning somewhere behind his walls. A dead child now legitimized the rule of the man who had just poisoned him. It was the last insult and the coldest one. Years later, in the great royal tumulus at Vergina, a silver funerary urn would be laid in a tomb alongside a gilded oak wreath and a boy's-sized suit of armor. And some who dig there believe those are the bones of the murdered king, given at last the burial his killer had denied him. The line was nearly gone. One drop of the blood still moved. Alexander had a full sister, Cleopatra, born of Olympias, the only surviving full sibling of the conqueror. Not the queen of Egypt whose name history remembers 3 centuries later, but an older Cleopatra, once queen of Epirus, married as a girl to her own uncle, Olympias's brother Alexander of Epirus, at the very wedding feast in Aegae, where their father, Philip II, was struck down by the sword of his bodyguard, Pausanias, in front of the whole assembled court. For years since, she had been a piece on the board, a woman whose hand could tip the balance of the whole empire, courted and bargained over again and again. She had once made ready to marry Leonatus, then Perdiccas, and every attempt had drawn armies into motion and helped start wars. By 308 BC, she was living under watch in Sardis, the old Lydian capital beneath the Acropolis, where Croesus had once counted his gold, in the heart of the territory ruled by Antigonus the One-Eyed. She was the last of the immediate royal family drawing breath, and whoever married her could claim to marry the dynasty itself. Ptolemy, safe behind the deserts of Egypt, reached for her. He sailed his fleet into the Aegean, took islands and coastal cities from Antigonus, and offered Cleopatra marriage, seeing in it the chance to bind his new kingdom to the last living branch of the old one, and claim the moral right to the whole inheritance. For Cleopatra, it was a rope thrown into the pit, a way out of Sardis, a throne in the richest land on earth, an escape from a lifetime of being handed from man to man like a treaty clause. She said yes. She made ready to slip out of the city and reach the coast where Ptolemy's ships waited at anchor. Antigonus had eyes in every corridor of Sardis, and the city's governor answered to him. He could not permit this marriage. Ptolemy, joined to Alexander's sister, would hold a claim too strong for anyone to answer, a lever that could pry the entire empire loose from the men who had seized it. She had to be stopped, and like Cassander before him, Antigonus knew that a public execution of Alexander's own sister was a fire he could not control. The name still carried too much weight among Macedonians and Greeks alike. So he arranged for her to die in silence. The killers were her own waiting women, turned against her by bribe or by threat, and they murdered their mistress inside her own chambers before she could reach the harbor road. Then Antigonus performed grief. He seized the very women who had done what he commanded and put them to death for the crime, silencing the only witnesses in the same stroke. He gave Cleopatra a funeral heavy with ceremony. Every honor owed a queen of the royal house, the pyre and the offerings, and the mourning of a whole city, and stood there as the loyal servant weeping over a dynasty he had just helped wipe from the earth. It was finished. The purge was complete. The house of Philip and Alexander, the Argead line that traced itself back to Heracles and had ruled Macedon for nearly 4 centuries before swallowing the known world, was gone into the ground. Every person who carried Alexander's blood was dead. His half-brother Philip III, knifed in a cramped cell by Thracian killers sent in ahead of Olympias. His mother Olympias, stoned and stabbed at her own door by the kin of the men she had purged. Her corpse left for the birds. His Persian wife Statera and her sister Drypetus, murdered and dropped into a well that was then filled with earth to hide them. His sister Cleopatra, killed by her own attendants in a room in Sardis while a fleet waited for her offshore. And his son and heir, Alexander IV, poisoned at his own table beside his mother Roxana, both buried in nameless graves above the Strymon. The men who had marched at Alexander's side, who had knelt at his corpse in Babylon and sworn on their swords to guard his legacy, now reached for crowns of their own. In 305 BC, they dropped the last of the pretense. Antigonus and his son Demetrius took the title of king first, after a great naval victory off Cyprus, and within the year the others followed, rather than kneel to them. Cassander, king of Macedon; Ptolemy, pharaoh of Egypt, founder of a house that would rule the Nile until another Cleopatra died beside Mark Antony 3 centuries on; Seleucus, king of an empire stretching from the sea to the borders of India; Lysimachus, king of Thrace. They raised their new dynasties on the bones of the family they had promised to protect, and their heirs would fight one another for another century and more. Only in Alexandria, sealed in a coffin inside a great tomb by the sea, the stolen body of Alexander the Great lay quiet, drawing pilgrims and emperors for centuries to come. Augustus would lay a golden crown on it and break its nose, the one relic left of a bloodline that had been hunted, cornered, and erased from the earth, one member at a time, by the men he had trusted most. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to its end. If these buried corners of the past are the kind of history you came here for, subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this video, and pass it to someone who still believes that loyalty and betrayal stand far apart. Down in the comments, tell us which of these deaths struck you hardest, and which of the successors you think was the coldest of them all. You've just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate history hub on YouTube. And your descent is not over. The video already appearing on your screen is the next chapter waiting for you. Click it. Start it now. Keep going down.